Hello, good morning.
Morning, how are you?
I'm really well, and it's really good to see you. I'm with Jules Daulby today, who is a specialist in education, inclusion, and literacy. And we're going to be talking today about a whole raft of things that we're all really passionate about. And it's so good to see you off Sky News, because you've been on Sky News a lot. You seem to be the go-to person.
Yeah. I'm on a list.
Yeah, I mean, it's exactly, you're on a list, and that's a great thing, because that means you have lots of interesting things to say on what we're going to talk about today. And I think I'm just going to go straight in and ask, the reason I've asked you to come on today is because of your passion that comes across really around inclusion and exclusion. And you'll know that exclusion is something I feel really strongly about, as I know you do. So where are we with that? Where are we in the world of inclusion and exclusion from where you're sitting?
It's very interesting. So I've been a teacher since 1996, and I didn't particularly go into the world of special needs or behaviour or exclusions until much later. But what I've seen happen over the years has been, for me, quite shocking. And I speak to a lot of heads, so I know a lot of heads endorse it. And the older heads, I think, will say the same, and the older teachers, that schools are, for various reasons, less inclusive than they used to be, mainstream schools particularly. There's a real complexity around it, which is the problem. So when you start discussing it with people, there's so many elements that's a real issue. But generally, I've seen inclusion work, and there are schools across the country that are doing it really well. But the message for me, I think I'm quite critical of the government. The message is that you have to do it in a certain way. So the behaviour messages that are coming through from the Department for Education seem to contradict, for me, the schools that are doing it really well, that aren't excluding in high numbers. So for me, I don't know how we're going to square that circle, because these children, when they're getting excluded, they're then going into pupil referral units. And again, although the quality varies across the country, the ones that I've witnessed and the ones that do it well do not have the same type of philosophy that, again, the DfE has. So that worries me, because we've got this message coming through from DfE that they're going to crack down on behaviour, that there's going to be we're going to get rid of all these children and ensure that everybody else in that school is safe. And that message for the public makes a lot of sense, doesn't it? Who wants their children in an unsafe school? So this narrative that we're hearing is one, it's quite divisive, I think. And for the thing that made me very passionate about it was that it's demonising children, and ensuring that, the 29 children are safe, while this one child, there's something wrong with them and they've got to go. And for me, that message is very dangerous. When you dig down into the figures as well, and when you start to see that actually these children are 7 times more likely to have a special educational need, they're 3 times more likely to be from a Black Caribbean heritage, traveller and gypsy populations are through the roof with regards to exclusions. So suddenly you then see actually this one child that the DfE might talk about are the disadvantaged children.
And that came across so clearly, didn't it, in the Timpson review, which we'll unpick in a little while. But I just want to bring us back, actually, because I think that understanding that space that we're in, where we have one message, narrative, funding stream at one end, and then we have really good practice at the other end, and they are polar opposites. I think that's something that needs articulating, because I think that's... People feel that, but don't necessarily say it or have a language to say it. And it's the same language around mental health, isn't it?
Yeah.
We have a society that has all sorts of complexities in it that prevent people from thriving in the way that we know humans thrive. And then we have all these things coming out saying we need to focus on mental health, so it's the same kind of thing, these
Yeah.
messages. But I'm interested in the heads that you were referring to, that have been around quite a long time. So that when you say about the complexity around why schools appear to be less, well, they don't appear to be, they are less inclusive, and that's anecdotally in evidence and also perhaps in evidence in the review. What are the reasons for that you're hearing, that the heads that that have been around a long time, what reasons are they saying, let's fill that complexity pot with some narrative?
So I think if we start off firstly with, so if I often talk about moral maths or ethical leaders, and those ones that really truly believe in a comprehensive system and inclusion, are working against a lot of issues at the moment. So for instance, funding has to be the biggest one. So there is no money around, and I think all heads would tell you that. Before I went on Sky recently, I did a bit of a poll on Twitter, and a number of heads came through and said things like that they'd had their SEN budget halved, and they've got the same amount, if not more, children with SEN. So that's one issue. Another issue is the lack of resources around a school. So it used to be, I remember working in a school where we had a teenage prevention service, we had counsellors, it was very easy to get to CAMS, the educational psychologists were in all the time. In 1996 it was free, so we've gone to this traded service where you have to buy in speech and language and you have to buy in ed psychs unless they're very high needs. So there's fewer people to help schools as well. So schools are pretty much doing it on their own. And often, and this was a lovely quote I heard from a head recently, and I think it's true, is that there are some schools that are doing miracle work on a shoestring budget. But that is becoming harder and harder to do. Now, but then if you then combine that with the accountability measures and league tables and high stakes testing, then actually what you've got is these heads are doing their utmost to ensure that all children are doing really well and are thriving, and they really want to do that, but actually then they're finding they're getting punished. So they're getting punished financially because you have what we call a £6,000 amounts that you're supposed to spend on children in SEN before they get any more budget. So, and one head teacher said to me that was like a fine. So if you have SEN children in your school, then you're almost fined £6,000 because you don't get any more money until you can prove that spending. And that isn't real. It's not real. You can't spend £6,000 on each child like that. So you're fined if you have lots of children with SEN. You're punished by Ofsted. There's very few inclusive schools I know that are getting the outstanding that other schools are getting. So the message is, if you don't have children with SEN, 1, you'll get better exam grades. 2, your progress 8 will be better. 3, Ofsted will come in and say you're outstanding. And also you're financially fined by £6,000 per head. So even if you're an ethical head and you want to do the right thing, you are absolutely up against it at the moment. And that's incredible. And that's why I like that phrase, that most schools are just doing miracles on a shoestring budget.
And again, we've got this dichotomy of messages, because we've got, Timpson doing his review, suggesting that they care about this situation, that they're really interested in it and want to do something about it. And then you have all these other things going on. I mean, is it just a case of people not speaking to each other, or is it something much more sinister?
It's really hard, isn't it? So I think it's probably a bit of both, but I think there's a slight denial as well. And this is where I'm very interested when the government talk about evidence-based work. So they're constantly saying that schools must be evidence-based now. We need to use lots of research, and I completely agree. But they seem to cherry pick which research they like. So when you start to look at the research around which children get excluded and why, that is very different to the narrative that comes from the DfE, I think, sometimes. And there is for me, there's a real denial about SEN sometimes. So unless children are very obviously SEN, then there's a bit of a denial and narrative that comes through. So I can quote you Amanda Spielman 2 or 3 years ago, who said ADHD was sometimes used as an excuse for poor behaviour by parents. Now that's come from the head of Ofsted. So we've got that denial. The behaviour guru Tom Bennett was also wrote an article saying that ADHD and dyslexia were pathologised. So again, that they were overdiagnosed and over-medicated. And again, the underlying theme is that these are just naughty children. Mm-hmm. So, and Nick Gibb again is very, there's nothing about dyslexia. He's passionate about literacy, and actually I am too. And I teach phonics, and I can see phonics is the way forward for a lot of children with dyslexia particularly. And yet he's unwilling to accept that there's something called dyslexia. Also, the research around developmental language disorder, which used to be called SLI, specific language impairment, we know that it's 7 times more common than autism. So it's one of the most common special educational needs, and yet there's nothing on language. And actually, in those children don't necessarily need phonics, they need language interventions. And the research and evidence base for language is huge, so Professor Bishop and Professor Norbury, Dr. Ebbles, all doing incredible work on speech and language. And yet none of that is threaded into our school intervention systems, the DFE. Ofsted wouldn't look for it necessarily. We've hardly got any speech and language therapists left, so we've got this. One minute we've got research and evidence that we have to use, and yet we're really happy to ignore the evidence, it seems to me, for children with special educational needs.
I mean, and I wonder, listening to you, all those things that are just not working together, not communicating together. We also are in a particular political point of time where, very little seems to be prominent and important other than Brexit, which I actually call Brexit. And so it's really difficult times. But in the meantime, children are the people who are really losing out in this.
Absolutely, and that's why I think I became quite driven to look at campaigning around exclusions and transparency, because what I'm seeing children internalise the fact that they're bad and they're wrong. And they are children that I would have seen, I believe, 15 years ago that would have thrived in a school, in the right schools. And there still are amazing schools out there that are doing that. But, if we have the same child, roughly the same child, it's almost like a terrible RCT, randomised controlled trial, because we've got, one child from disadvantaged background, complex life with ADHD and, very poor literacy skills, in one school thriving, and then in another school sat in an isolation booth for weeks on end until they finally get excluded into a pupil referral unit. Now, those 2 children should both be in a mainstream school and thriving. One is doing really well, and the other one has internalised the fact that they are bad and they're wrong, and then they're meeting peers in a similar situation. And we know that pipeline to prison is really, really they're very vulnerable. And
the denial around that is huge though, Jules, isn't it? The denial around even that children are placed in isolation. I mean, in the 80s at school, I spent most of my time in the music room. We might have nice little fancy booths now, which are, you are potentially with a person, but that's only one step away. That's only one step away from being in a room on your own for hours on end.
And that really worries me. And again, so I know, because I do some work on Ban the Booze with Paul Dix, and I ummed and ahed about joining that, because I know people don't like the absolute ban the booze, but actually I thought this is the only way we're going to start looking at this, because probably like you, in my day when I was a teacher in 96, we did have isolation booze, but there were 3, I think, maybe 6 in one room. It was next to the head teacher and the sort of senior management team corridor, and and it was the corridor of death for children if they ever got there. And you'd often have a couple sitting in there, but actually the people that looked after those at-risk children were the head and the deputy head, and and the senior management team. What we're seeing now are staffed rooms, with 20 booths in them. Now, if you've got 20 of your most, say, challenging behaviour, and I use that with inverted commas, children in one room with a member of staff that is not paid well. Okay, these are not senior management that staff these rooms. These are, teaching assistants or supervisors that are staffing these rooms. If you've got 20 children in that room and, an inexperienced and not a well-paid person looking after that room, then actually the only way you could control that room and have it silent is by having incredibly strict rules around that. So, you've got to sit up straight. You're not allowed to lean out of your booth, because you could turn around to your friends. You've got to go, you've got to sit forward, you've got to sit up. I had one story recently where a boy was put in isolation a whole day, a following day, because he put his head on his arm 15 minutes before the time at the end of the day. Now, I'm sure these are isolated cases and they're not much, but the fact they're happening at all in any school is for me an intolerable situation. I don't care if it's one school in the whole of the country. The head teacher of that school should know what's happening in that room, and that is not acceptable to me. These are children, and no child should be treated like that, no matter what they've done.
Well, not only that, we know that that's not relevant in child development. Children who develop need other humans and need to thrive. They thrive and grow and build in that context. But you're absolutely spot on about the less experienced staff. I mean, you'll remember the hoo-ha on Twitter regarding the school advertising for the behaviour correction lead, which found me in the local newspaper with a poll running, do you or do you not agree with Lisa Cherry? Which is but one of the things that's really important at the bottom of that advert, you don't need experience not required for this position of working with some of the vulnerable children. And the one thing that is to have somebody with some kind of clue about how to work with that child or young person.
And actually, I at a talk the other day, I was saying very similar. I was saying, I'm expensive, and people like me and you should be in these rooms. And it sounds probably quite arrogant, but it's not about that. This is, we should have the highest paid, the most experienced and specialised people running those rooms. But it worries me as well, because these are the children, it's very likely that the same categories in that isolation room are the same categories that are being excluded. So they will likely to be special educational needs, traveller gypsies, communities, children from Black and Caribbean heritage. So if you're doing an audit of your isolation room and that is happening every time, then something has to be done about that, because clearly the isolation room is not working. And again, there should be teaching in there. They've probably got really poor literacy skills, so get a literacy specialist in there, get them to teach small groups. They are missing so much of their education in those rooms, and it is just linked to behaviour. And actually, they are there to learn.
And absolutely. And we've also can add into those groups looked after children, adopted children.
Absolutely. Looked after children actually are huge. I should have mentioned them earlier. They're really vulnerable.
And the same with adopted children. And if we think about the concept of belonging, we're wired to belong. This isn't rocket science. We're wired up to belong. If you're not going to belong in a school, there are so many avenues now where you can belong, and they're called gangs, child sexual exploitation, radicalisation. There are spaces for you, and people know how to find you as a vulnerable child and make sure that you can be the supply chain for those aspects. So, and that's one of the things that I feel most distressed about, is that we are where we are now produces a supply chain for abusers, and this is a huge problem. And then we have the same problem with government again, where they're going, we need to do something, let's tackle violence, let's do this, without having any kind of fundamental understanding about what that actually looks like and how that works, and how children, young people are made available by the very systems that are supposed to protect them.
Yeah, and what's really interesting about that too is in every service you speak to, so social services, speech and language therapists, psychologists, the police, everybody will say the same thing: early intervention. And that doesn't mean early intervention necessarily when they're young, although that's really great because you can pick up an at-risk language child at 3, but actually early intervention no matter what age, when they start to show at-risk behaviours. And this is the problem with thresholds being so high for these services, that we don't do early intervention in this country at the moment, and in schools. It has to reach crisis before we do anything about it. And that's a scandal, because early intervention in the long run is much cheaper. Early intervention will do far less damage to children and families, and also will help schools out. So it absolutely makes sense to put in as many resources as possible into prevention and early intervention, and then in the long term we see far less of what you're talking about.
And we all bang that drum and have done for a long time, and I just have to hope that at some point somebody will go, yeah, you're right. But we've got to just keep on keeping on, really, and that's why I think this is so important. These conversations are so important, so that people can who don't have a narrative around what's happening, but can feel they're in a dysfunctional family, which is the society we're living in, can start to develop a narrative to help argue on behalf of those children. But just I'd like to just take a quick view from you about the exclusion review, because it was the first one, wasn't it, that has been done about what that looks like, and none of us would have had any surprises about the 78% cohort that were shown as predominant for exclusion. But at the same time, what's going to happen now? It's in black and white. What does it actually mean to have done that report and to have that information in the public domain?
Well, I feel very sad about the Timpson review. I think everybody was very excited by it, and people I know that were on it talked about the use, that the work they were finding, and everyone was shocked by the results they were getting. And yet then there was a big delay before the Timpson review came out, and it had been sanitised, I think. I haven't seen the original. I'm guessing it was sanitised. But also it was filled with contradictions. So it was almost like it had been taken and, you can't say that, so we'll have to put that in. And, we do have to have very strict behaviour, so we've got to put that in. And so it did feel like it had been behavioured, if you like. I don't know what Edward Timpson thinks about that. I know I don't know what people on the Timpson review feel about that. But even the fact it had been sanitised, it was still shocking. So it worries me to think, well, okay, what else did they hide from that review? But that's just conjecture. But for me, what's come out of it and the exclusionist review, we have known this stuff for a long time, and the other, all the other reports we've had, right down to the Warnock report, each time it comes down to good inclusive practices. And that does mean that you can't teach 30 in a classroom without any support systems in place. So I'm a great one for inclusive teaching, and I've done lots on the inclusive classroom and how to be an inclusive teacher. But you do need support mechanisms in place with early intervention. Where I think the government, for me, have gone wrong is that they've seen that support mechanism as a very old-fashioned, strict behaviour system. So, and actually, as a new teacher, you don't want that child in your classroom. You do want to teach the others. And so, but actually, think of the difference between, a deputy head coming in and saying, look, let me look after this class while I take while you go and speak to that child that's causing you difficulty. Try and unpick it with them. I'll look after your class. And then maybe at the end of the day, you need to contact the family or the carers and, work out what's going on with that child. That is very different to 5 behaviour points on a SIM system in some kind of ridiculous pyramid system, and then you get 24 hours in isolation. The two is so different. And, nipping stuff in the bud, you can escalate a situation. So this is what frustrates. And I think most people that work in special needs and that sort of therapeutic work can see how quickly a situation can escalate. I've worked with children that I know I could get them to get excluded within 2 days, or escalate a situation so they do something. But of course you don't, because you de-escalate a situation. You try and talk to them, and you try and talk to the family. You give them time to cool off. Those sorts of situations in schools absolutely have to be there. But the teacher does need to be involved. And actually what happens at the moment, we devolve the situation from the classroom teacher in the guise that we're supporting them, but then removing that child from all lessons. So that's the other thing with this 24-hour isolation that is becoming very popular. The child might have good relationships and doing some really good work in other lessons, but they're removed from all lessons. So that sense of belonging is gone completely. And, again, it's internalising these behaviours. So rather than building up the successes in the lessons they're doing really well in, and that's, again, in the schools that I've seen that do this really well, will do that, and then really working on the relationships with the teacher where there is some disruption. And this isn't about blaming teachers. And again, you can get these very binary situations where, say, well, look, we need to work with this teacher and we need to look at the inclusive practices. We need to look at this and that. And suddenly it's like, oh, you're telling me that teacher's really bad then, are you? Oh, yeah, blame the teacher. No, I'm not blaming the teacher at all, But when you're a new teacher particularly, you've got so much to learn. I mean, I made some howlers of some mistakes, but I did have the support. And I was really lucky. I had some, real issues with behaviour in my classroom, but I had a really good support mechanism to help me.
I think having that, one of the things we don't have really, I suppose, are those kind of mentoring opportunities. Teachers do tend to go straight into the classroom, and what you're talking about around escalation is just so important, because for all the reasons that you said, but also because you're the adult. If for no other reason, you're the adult, you're the person who is fully formed, in terms of your stages of development, although that's debatable. When you get to 40, I think it all kicks off again. You have another stage of development. But you're the person, you're dealing with the developing child who is looking to you. They're looking to you for other ways of doing things. So, I mean, God, we could talk about this all day. You've been such a brilliant person to talk to, and I wonder, can we leave people with some kind of message of hope, but also what can, there's things that you've talked about that I would really like to say, right, we need to do this, we need to do that, but my brain doesn't work like that until I watch it back. So what can what would you say are the things that are going to make a real difference for people?
Well, and again, there will be two ways. So there's the perfect world when there's more resourcing and more systems in place. So in a perfect world, a school will have all the support mechanisms they used to have back. So, the thresholds will be lower for CAMS, the threshold will be lower. We should have free education psychologists and specialist teachers going in, and children should be identified and early intervention put in place. So that's the perfect world. But for schools, particularly under real financial stresses, one of the things I think is really important actually, and it's always been either or. The connection for teachers is that it is incredibly stressful to have behaviour in your class, so we do need to tackle that. But it's around enabling and supporting a teacher, and keeping those child is wherever possible in class or out of class for as short a time as possible. So I would absolutely, I'm afraid, ban 24-hour isolations or 12 hours. I saw a 24-hour one the other day. That's why I'm talking about it. I would ban that idea of being in isolation all day. It has to be much more attuned. but I would go for early intervention, and then I would keep the training going. So we talk about ITE a lot for teachers in inclusive practice, but actually I'm not convinced, because there is, like when you learn to drive a car, there's so much when you first start that actually inclusive practice comes with age. And I think the more experienced teachers just do inclusion naturally, as long as they have the right mindset. So I've seen some fantastic NQTs do it really well as well, but the more challenging situations. So we need to keep our teachers well. We need to ensure their workload is less, and the accountability measures of getting, incredible results, that needs to come down. And they need to be supported by looking after each and every child in their class. And then their inclusive practice should be, it's not around different worksheets for differentiation, but it is just knowing your children really well and really caring about them. So I always talk about the curious teacher, because actually if you're a teacher, you sort of see a behaviour, and actually that's an opportunity to learn. I'm going to become a better teacher. God, what's happening there? Why is that child behaving like that? Who can I talk to? But teachers need time to do that as well. So the whole structure needs more support, more time, more money, but a mindset as well. I do think there are still really great inclusive schools doing fantastic work, because they have the mindset that they want these children in their schools and they value these children. And those sort of 300 schools that Ofsted are picking out, the Policy Institute are picking out, that these 300 schools that where there's lots of unexplained exits, high levels of exclusion, and very strict, you need to think carefully before you come to our school, really irritates me, because if you live next door, you shouldn't have to think carefully at all. You should just go there automatically. That really irritates me, that kind of soft selection processes, that the few schools, that's where Ofsted should be stamping down. And actually Ofsted are giving them the green flag at the moment and giving them outstanding, and they should be stamping out that behaviour and valuing the other schools.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that was really interesting about that school with the behaviour lead that was all, we all got very distressed about, was the amount of private messages that I got from people who said, that's in my area and I had to move. So that selection process.
I get so many of those. Yeah. I hear so many people that are too scared to talk about this stuff, but the data is showing us, the unexplained exits that the Education Policy Institute, these 300 schools, I haven't done it, but you could almost guarantee that most of them have got outstanding, and that's a scandal. It feels to me it's like it feels like drug abuse in the Olympics, but they're not actually even taking the drug tests. These schools in these schools, and until they do that, and again, the inclusive schools, the heads that I talk to, they're very cross about that too, because they're saying it's not a level playing field. We're being inclusive, we're not rewarded for that, and the school down the road is excluding these children. There's unexplained exits all over the place. They've got they're soft selected because it's so strict. A lot of parents won't even choose to send their child there. Of the type of families that they don't want, that's not a level playing field. So it's I am critical of those schools, because it's not fair on the other schools that are doing the right thing.
Yeah, and just to kind of finish up thinking about that relationship and practices, I was in a school and we were doing a piece of work that was around trauma-informed approaches in school. There was a lot of complexity in the school, and the senior leadership team were kind of going, I miss being in the classroom and all the rest of it. And I said, okay, so let's try something. When you are called to come and get a child, you do the teaching and let the teacher take the child out of the classroom so that they can build the relationship, so that they're front loading that relationship ready for the time. And I've mentioned this to a few people, and it's kind of seen as very like a revolutionary kind of thing that some people would just find absolutely abhorrent, which I just find that bizarre, because surely the best person to build a relationship with those children is the teacher. So the teacher can go out and use an emotion coaching strategy with that child. The senior leadership team don't have to be the dragon people. They're in the classroom, also getting to know the children and doing some teaching, which, let's face it, most senior leadership team, that's the bit they miss, is doing the teaching element. it seemed like a win-win, and it was very successful in that school. So there are things that you can do that might feel like they're thinking outside of the box, but actually what you're saying and what I'm saying and what most of us are saying that are passionate about this is that it's actually about the commitment. It's about the commitment to think about what's going to work in your area, what's going to work in your school, in your community, that actually supports your community to have young people leaving the education system equipped to be part of that community.
Yeah, absolutely. And and we must also remember that it's around family and parent partnership as well, because the most successful schools have really good relationships with the parents. I've been in schools where parents aren't allowed through the school gates because they've been banned due to conflict, and actually I think sometimes it's the head trying to protect his staff or her staff, but somewhere along the lines that there needs to be conflict resolution there. To have a situation where families are not allowed through the school gates for whatever reason is not ideal. And I do, each time it always feels I'm critical of schools, and I'm aware of that. But it's the schools that do it well. They have conflict resolution, parent partnership officers, or whatever. I often talk to people say, oh, these parents are really difficult to engage, and you say, well, have you tried ringing them? and they've often not actually spoken to these difficult to engage parents.
Jules, fancy you saying something like that, phoning parent.
Yeah, have you tried phone? And that sort of thing. And I think all parents and families love their kids and will generally do, even if they struggle to begin with, will do what's best. And they are able to engage, and that's part of the school's job as well. It's not just about the students, it is also about the whole families. That's the community level of the comprehensive system, and that's what I feel that sometimes we're losing.
Education for all.
Education for all. We are one community. These children belong to all of us, and this isn't just if you get rid of this one child then everything's going to be fine. That one child is our community and part of us. And actually, this idea that our schools are going to be safe, that's another word that the government are using a lot at the moment, safe, and I find that very divisive, because actually none of us are safe. If we start to exclude these children, even if they're safe in the classroom, they're not safe when they leave the school gates.
No.
And one person that I was arguing about this with recently said, well, it's okay because I picked my daughter up from school. And I'm like, well, so is that our answer? That because we feel so unsafe outside of the school gates, we're all going to pick our children up from there because we're worried about them getting stabbed on the pavement outside. So this has ramifications for everybody, for the whole community. And so this idea that they're safe in the classroom, well, yes, but are they safe outside? Because it's the butterfly effect, isn't it? It has effect on everybody. So it's a community, and we all need to be part of that community. And we need to support our teachers who do incredible work, and we need to support our schools who are doing incredible work, and our pupil referral units who are doing incredible work. But it should be joined up and working together. And I think there is a bit of at the moment this pull where we are dividing people, and I think that's a real shame. Yeah.
Listen, Jules, it's been great speaking to you, and I just would really like to thank you for speaking with me today. I'll pop your details into the box underneath, and keep up the great, fantastic work. And
thank you. You too.
I will undoubtedly see you on Twitter.
Yes.
All right. Take care.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. Bye.